This podcast is part of the Blueberry Network. Blueberry.com is where listeners and podcasters come together. Check it out at blueberrywithnoease.com.
So the Earbud U podcast, while fun to put together, doesn't run for free. And while we're happy to be a new member of the Blueberry Network, we'd like you, our faithful listeners, to do something for us. If you're thinking about engaging with podcasting either now or in the future, and you're stuck on a hosting company, Blueberry is for you. Look, there are a lot of podcast distribution companies out there that are going to make you a lot of promises. But Blueberry offers 3 things that made it my go-to when starting the Earbud U podcast. Number 1, convenience. With the PowerPress plugin and WordPress integration, it works with around 90% of all websites out there. Number 2, optimization. Yeah, it took me a while to accept that Apple and iTunes pretty much rule the roost when it comes to podcast distribution. But after I came to that realization, Blueberry was great at making everything very, very easy. Number 3, publishing and distribution is simple. Look, I have a lot of stuff going on in my life. I design corporate trainings, I give speeches, I write blog posts, and occasionally I get to see Mrs. Earbud U and the kids. But with Blueberry, publishing my podcast was done and over in 3 easy steps. No muss, no fuss, no bother. Look, head on over to blueberry.com, no ease, and type in the promo code earbud_u, and they'll give you a month of hosting service for free on me. You can't beat that deal with a stick. That's blueberry.com, no ease, and type in the promo code earbud_u. And now, on with the show. Race, culture, education, and technology. All of these things matter to our guest today on the Earbud U podcast, and she's going to make sure that you at least think about some of them before we're done here. Welcome to the show. This is Earbud U, Season 3, Episode number 9. In our world today, race, gender, and culture seem to matter more now than ever before. Now, this interview sort of dovetails with the interview that I did with Mitch Mitchell a couple of episodes back. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this, but a person's vocal inflections, tone, and language should have no racial overtones. But I remember the last time we went around and around the block about race in this country, this blessed United States of America. You remember the last time we went around and around about this? Come on, you remember. During the Orenthal James Simpson trial. And I remember there was some discussion about whether or not OJ had a quote-unquote black-sounding voice. Just thinking about OJ is kind of depressing to me, so let's take a break and hear a word from our sponsor. Me? When you're talking about business development for the Peace Builder, things can get tricky for you as a Peace Builder if you can't define your unique value. In my new book, Marketing for Peace Builders, How to Market Your Value to a World in Conflict, I lay it all on the line for you. I tell you everything I've done to grow my business, including how I found out what the value of my skills as a Peace Builder were to my market, and how to value them against the market. This is not easy, I won't lie to you, but it is worthwhile. Just like making peace is worthwhile to a world in conflict. Order your copy today and get a handle on advocating for your value right now. Look, visit Amazon.com today and type in Marketing for Peace Builders. The book is only $26.99, and you won't have to pay for shipping if you order it using your Amazon Prime account. And while you're there, leave a review and follow my author page. There's links to my blog, links to the Earbud U podcast, and there's even links to the LinkedIn group for this book as well. Finally, once you've received your copy in the mail, tear that package open, take a picture with you in the book, and tag all your friends and associates, and me at Human Services Consulting and Training on Facebook and show them that you're committed to developing as a peace builder today. Look, you're helping me, I'll be honest. You're helping my kids, and you're helping your world as well. And thanks. All right, and we're back. So go get a copy of that book and get educated. Speaking of language, just something that's less depressing. So let's talk a little bit about language. I had a grandmother, and I've sometimes talked about her on the podcast, but let me never necessarily in the introduction. So let me sort of talk a little bit about Grandma Jesan, as they used to call her in college. Now, my grandmother came from a time when women and minorities in the United States in general weren't getting a public fair shake in any kind of sense of the word. And she raised me to speak with as clean and as unaccented a voice as she possibly could. She believed, as Booker T. Washington before her also did, that speaking well was the first step toward writing well, which led inevitably to living well in a racist, prejudiced society. I think that our guest today, Qiana Patterson, would have had an interesting discussion with my grandmother. Now, these are two women separated by years of history and even by philosophies, how they look at the world. That's not to say that Qiana's perspective or philosophy on education, race, and where they meet in the realm of technology is problematic, nor is it to say that my grandmother's perspective or philosophy on education and race and where they might have met in the realm of technology was problematic. My grandmother's passed away, and Qiana is still here. I think that we have to be open, however, to hearing from everybody in this racially, ethnically, and even economically diverse world. Because if we're not open, and if we don't want to hear, then self-awareness, self-motivation, and the courage to act differently, forget just thinking differently, pache, Apple computers, become mere punchlines that we just wind up repeating over and over again at cocktail parties. And I think that my grandmother, Qiana, and even myself have had quite enough of all that. Haven't you? All right. Well, that's it. Let's get into it. Welcome to Earbud U, Season 3, Episode number 9. Get your knowledge on through your earbuds. Our special guest for our show today is Qiana Patterson. Now, Qiana has an eclectic and varied background devoted to the advancing of education through the use of technology. She also stands as an example of a minority entrepreneur working in the hothouse environment of the California startup community and making a dent in the universe that's all her own. Qiana Patterson is the 1993 Seattle Community Program alumna and the current CEO, and she'll talk about a little more about that, of New Global Citizens, and the former COO of Edilio, a Los Angeles-based education technology company. A former teacher, Qiana taught middle school for 5 years before becoming the dean at John Burroughs Middle School, one of the most diverse and academically enriched middle schools within the Los Angeles Unified School District. She has a deep understanding of the intersection between education, current technology trends, and entrepreneurship. Now, we look forward to talking with Qiana today as a dovetail to our first interview all the way back at the beginning of Season 3, and we're very happy to have her here. Welcome to Earbud U, Qiana.
Welcome. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So I gave you a really long introduction. I hit on some points in there. Why don't you go ahead and clean it up for us a little bit? For our listeners, tell us, what is it that you do exactly?
So I just recently actually transitioned out of being the CEO of New Global Citizens, part of being or taking a role leading a nonprofit coming from the for-profit world of education as you come in with all this knowledge on what schools buy, what they don't buy, and the market sort of access to a product that you're introducing. And basically I came in and did a real good evaluation of what they were offering and the viability of the program and anything that we would have to do in order to scale and reach sustainability and ultimately the board and others who were supporting the organization did not have the sort of, what do I call it, the ability to put that much more energy into it based on my experience selling into the K-12 marketplace. So ultimately, they decided to scale the organization down and to sell off or give away the assets, which is the curriculum that they had.
Okay. Now, those kinds of things happen all the time,
Mm-hmm.
in the hothouse space, like I said, of the California startup community. Um, what are you doing now?
So right now I've been consulting actually with another nonprofit and with also a new startup that's based in Mountain View. So those two, interesting enough, those two organizations and companies sought me out for my expertise and help.
Awesome, awesome. And one of those organizations was Google, because that's the only thing in Mountain View, right?
No, no,
No. I'm kidding.
I
My
wish.
last one of my previous guests, he's knee deep in the Google ecosystem, for gathering data and surveillance, or not surveillance, but gathering data for the benefit of
Call it what it
advancing the
is. It is
mediation field.
surveillance. Call it what it is.
Well,
Big Brother.
I mean.
They might as well just name themselves Big Brother instead of Alphabet. Let's just call it what it is. Surveillance.
Well, and when you capitalize the B in big and the B in brother, I mean, those are capital alphabet letters. I mean,
Right.
anyway. So let's talk about the core of like your life,
Mm-hmm.
education technology. What is the state of educational technology in America? And I'm sure you're going to tell me it's. And I'm just going to leave that door open. What is the state of educational technology in
So
America?
one of the things that I will start off and say is that I don't believe there's anything such as education technology. And I liken that to when the automobile industry decides to use robots on their assembly line, or they use technology to make and improve themselves. They don't start calling the automobile industry this automobile technology. Education and the use of technology is just a natural progression. It's where we are today. We don't imagine buying books and things like that if we have tablets that could severely reduce the cost and that we can change more rapidly and quickly. So that's my sort of spiel about this ed tech or ed technology. It is just education. It is 2015, soon to be 2016. And this is where we are, and we're using a lot of technology to make better decisions on how we educate students in this country. But if we were to look at specifically what is the what is the use case for technology, where are we at with it, and how we're using, I think two things stand out to me is equity and the efficacy of the technology that we're using. So equity means with all the devices and the things that we're using, who are getting them and who has access to them, right? And is there equity along the spectrum of those students who have access to those technologies and how they're using it? And then the efficacy part is, so what? So what that they have technology? So what that we have a tablet? So what that we have all this data that tells us all these sorts of things? If we don't know if it actually improves what we're doing in our country in terms of education, and that's globally as well. So those are the two things that stand out to me, and those are the two things that everyone, I think, who are invested in this space are really trying to contemplate and really trying to figure out how do we improve and how we spread equity amongst what we're using, and then how do we make sure that it's doing what it says we think it's supposed to do, and why, and constantly question why we want that to be done.
Um, so there's two areas there that I want to focus on. You talked about equity and efficacy.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about access and so what.
Mm-hmm.
Let's break both of those down. What does access mean when a student in the LA County School District,
Mm-hmm.
let's use that as an example, has not an Android, has an Apple phone in their pocket?
Right.
What does access mean when they have that phone in their pocket, but they potentially are going to graduate from the LA, Unified School District not being able to read their diploma.
Right. So
what does access mean in that real world sort of context?
So the interesting thing when you talk about having that iPhone or having an Android in your back pocket, right, is whether or not the student utilizes that product, whatever it is, right, that hardware device or software,
Sure.
To push and to ensure that they can read their diploma, right? So when we talk about specifically like equity, we want to know, and then in terms of being able to read, which would be the efficacy part, is whether or not that tablet or that thing that they have in their pocket, is it something that they're only using while they're on the premises of the school? Is it only 1 hour during the day? Is it 30 minutes? Is it something that they can take back and forth to their home? You have to think about a lot of those kids who are receiving free and reduced lunch, who are in high urban areas, do not have internet access at home. They may or may not have a computer at home. So what good is it if we have tablets and we have these things, and yet they can only use it for an hour a day or 2 hours a day, or when they get home and they encounter something they don't understand, do they have the ability to actually then go online or reach out for resources to figure that out? And that has been a huge thing, because we know that a lot of classrooms and schools do not allow for the students to take the devices home. But the other important thing is the idea that if you have this tablet, that somehow automatically grants you, access to the entire world. And while the internet does sort of grant us information, and a lot of people in the tech world say everything is at the palm of your hands, essentially. You can figure out anything. You can take a class online. But whether or not students know how to use that. So we talk about digital literacy, right? And do they actually know how to use it and how to use that device or that software to the best of their ability? And do we even teach in that way? Like, so you have to think, like, most of the teachers in this country went to school not utilizing technology in their classroom. So what is the expectation that the credentialed teachers in this country, who I really respect and I consider myself to still be a teacher, like I didn't go into the teaching program that I went to at UCLA, and coming out of it having a real understanding of how was I supposed to use technology in the classroom. And even, we all know, if we live in this technology age, that things happen so rapidly and fast, that how do you as a teacher, you able to actually go with those times of change constantly? So there's the issue of whether or not the educators themselves have the ability to teach with that product, and are they teaching with that product to the best of their ability? And then two, whether or not the students are digital literate with this product and what they do with it outside. So a perfect example is when LA Unified rolled out the iPads, and everyone knows a lot about the iPad debacle, as we like to call it. And then, so one of the first things that hit the newsstands is that a lot of students were able to hack into it, and then were able to use it to get online to other things that the tablet itself wasn't essentially designed to allow them to do. And I actually had an insider conversation with someone who was on the task force or on the project. And I said, it sounds to me that those are the very same students that I would hire on my dev team, because those are the types of people that I want to problem solve, to dig deep, and then turn that, right? So they did that thing, right? They hacked into the iPads and started utilizing it to go to YouTube or what you have it, whatever. But those are the kind of kids that you actually want, and they become adults, to actually work on your dev teams, to work on your product teams. You don't want them to just take what they have and then that's it. You want them to dig deeper, and these students figured it out. Now, I applaud them for being able to figure that out, and then I would have turned it around and saying, well, why did this happen? And that basically exposes a bug. So I would have said, hey, like, we have people who are on QA teams and stuff who are trying to root out bugs in our system, right? And so that in itself is, I think, a good thing. So how do we turn that around and not criminalize a child for doing something like that? For me, it was a positive thing.
Now, I would look at that as a feature, not a bug, but that's my perspective. Let's get back to the problem hacking and problem solving. And this is part of a a thesis that I've been developing in my head over the last few months. And I'm a corporate trainer in my other life, and I deal with a lot of adults who were not educated in a digital world, not even close. And the area of the country in which I live, all the way across the country, predominantly rural, predominantly poor, predominantly high school educated, and also predominantly white. And we'll get into the racial piece in a minute here. They work very hard, to do work, post-manufacturing environment. And it's not the hothouse of California startup, not even close, When you talk about problem solving and hacking, you're talking about new skills for a new future that aren't similar in any kind of reasonable way to the Industrial Revolution based skills of sit down, be quiet, do what the man tells you to do, and collect your check and go home, that we were all sort of raised under for the last 100 years of the Industrial Revolution, which, by the way, I'm not knocking the Industrial Revolution, brought us more prosperity to more people, history of the globe ever, right?
Right.
But we're at this, and here's the core of my thesis with all that being said. The core of my thesis is we're at this weird time in human history where the majority of us, and I don't mean all, but the majority of us, at least in the developed world, and I use that in air quotes, and I know that's a loaded term, that's why I use it in air quotes. We're literate enough to know that this change is happening. We're literate enough to read about the change happening. We're even literate enough and problem-solving oriented enough to be able to access tools that give us information about the changes that are happening all around us at lightning speed. But our brains haven't caught up to those changes yet, and our societies and cultures haven't caught up to those changes yet, and our educational system hasn't been redesigned to catch up to those yet, because it takes a long time to rehack a 100-year-old system. But we don't have the patience for that anymore because we're literate enough to know that we want more. It's part of the more revolution. Moises Naim talks about this in his book, The End of Power. We want the more that we see. We see this in countries that are developing, like China, and moving more towards a consumption-based culture where the images that they see pumped in, they want those things now. And it may not be everybody, but it's enough folks to where it's a zeitgeist and it's starting to happen. When you talk about problem solving and hacking, and you talk about digital literacy, are these just things that are going to work out in the wash anyway, 50 years down the road? Or is this part of a bigger societal trend that we must have our hands on the pulse of to be able to navigate it to get better outcomes?
I definitely, so the latter for me. I think that we need to adjust and we need to shift because what's going to happen is that we're just going to further the divide, right? We're just going to further who can do it, who does have the skill set to do it, and who does not. And anyone who does not know how to do that is going to be left behind. And I believe that technology will always essentially, because we never know what's going to hit and what's going to be big and what's going to take off, right? Just think about the electric car, right? So in the 1800s, 40% of the cars that were there were electric, right? And then we abandoned that for fossil fuels, right?
Correct.
And now we're kind of going backwards, right? So the reason I say that is because we never know what's going to hit. But it's the people who have the ability, varied skills, that have the ability to bounce around, right? So if you're an electrical engineer, right, you presumably you don't necessarily have to be an electrical engineer in a factory somewhere, right? But now with the revolution of electric cars and stuff, electrical engineers will be even at greater need, right? When we actually move away from fossil fuels and we start looking at other things. So, but the thing is that does that electrical engineer or does that person know how to make that shift? I don't think that we've taught people how to do that, right? Because we've still been educated in a path that says, okay, you're going to be an electrical engineer and then you're going to do that, right? And then whether or not you know how to take those skills, you know how to take that experience and then shift that to working at Tesla, to shift that and work that at NASA, to shift that and go and work for a new IoT company, a startup or whatever. I think that's the part that we have yet to figure out, that how do you get people to be able to switch more rapidly? And that is the piece that I think that we are at a great disadvantage for. And I think that, just think about it. We used to have this, well, we had the Industrial Revolution, and then we had, in high schools, we had electrical, we had wood shop, we had all of these things, right? And now guess what we're doing? We're kind of going backwards again. We're going backwards, and we're not teaching kids about wood shop, but we're actually saying the kid should come out with a skill like being able to code. That's nothing new. We're just kind of retooling that, right? Retooling that. Now, I would like schools to add that kids don't need to have a set pathway, because we're still prepping kids as if they all need to code. We all need to code. We all need to be Java developers, learn C++, learn this. And then that's going to, again, get them to have to go down a very narrow path. And what I would like to say, or for schools to make that switch is that, do we teach kids that they can learn skills, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that over time they add on more skills that would allow them to make that shift. And we don't, in a sense, teach kids to be able to be creative or be collaborative or be resilient so that they can bounce around like that. We used to think, oh, we're going to work for 20, 30 years in the same profession. We don't do that anymore, right?
Yeah.
And then when we're forced now to do it, people are scared out of their minds, right? We make this moving and shifting very difficult and hard for people to do, on the employer side and on the person who's looking for the job as well. So I think that those are the things that I think, in terms of us being behind, we need to teach the kids now and young adults now how to be able to make that switch very rapidly, so that we don't get stuck in a rut again.
Yep. I once, I was in higher education for a decade. And so I got to see the end result of, that education.
Mm-hmm.
And, in a land grant institution, much cheaper than a private educational institution. Land grant higher education institutions will exist for quite a few more years. They are in the process of retooling because they see this switching happening, but I don't see it happening at the K through 12 level. I still see, and this is my one of my problems with Common Core. I got a 10-year-old and a 5-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they're going through Common Core.
Mm-hmm.
And I sit with a teacher, and I expressed this to another guest on the podcast this season as well. But I sit with a teacher, and the teacher was educated in a particular way. Teacher doesn't know what I know. I don't know what the teacher knows. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're both operating in two different silos, but we can both go on Google and find out what each other knows.
Right.
But you're training the kids in this, again, it's still, Common Core is still based on these narrow bands of regulation. And then you're punishing teachers if they don't meet those standards. And to me, that's totally from a person who's got a 5-year-old who's going to conservatively live until the end of this century. That to me seems totally illogical and not prepping her for the future.
So, no matter where you stand on Common Core, I think that I'm not
talking about it from a political perspective. I'm talking about it from a like you said, that switching and hacking perspective.
I think the whole pipeline of education, pre-K to higher ed, is broken, right? Because if you think about it, even if the universities are changing, whether you're private or land grant, it doesn't matter, right? Even if they're changing, they're still requiring the same things of the high schools in this country, of K through 12.
Exactly.
They're still saying
K through 12
you need to do X, Y, and Z, and the kids need to pass this test, the SAT or the ACT, and they need to have these kind of grades, and they need to have this kind of curriculum, and all of those things are still set in motion, right? And so until we change that entire pipeline that then benefits everyone, then it won't matter if it's Common Core or No Child Left Behind or whatever. We have to just look at it and say, this is broken, right? this is broken. And how is it that some of the, what we consider to be the most fascinating minds, the best, most inventive, most creative men and women of this country, a large percentage of them did not complete college.
Oh, no.
Right? And
oh,
so
no. Yeah.
what about that experience, right? What about having that creativity and that fluidity to sort of explore is actually relevant to being able to be the best that you possibly can be? Now, I mean, for some students, that I can't say that that can be for everybody. I still believe that there's going to be paths that people take. I don't want my doctor, I'm sorry, I don't want my OBGYN who kind of like took a few classes online and then has a micro credential in OBGYN. I'm sorry, I don't want that, right? It's
right,
true,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I agree that there's still some professions, look, that, you know, we just can't get away from the status, the credentialing and whatever. But there's lots of other things that we can do in this whole pipeline that then says, and think about it, like extension classes, right? Mm-hmm. What is the power of an extension class if you go to UCLA or you go to some of these other public institutions and you take basically top tier classes and you don't actually have to, you know, apply, which is the same thing as, you know, going to General Assembly or something to that effect, right? How can you, or learning online from lynda.com or, you know, something else online, how can you actually get the skills that allows you to do and to perform just like everybody else in that particular field? Or maybe you're just interested in it. But I think that there's power in looking at some of the things that even already exist. Why is it that extension courses and programs haven't jumped on the bandwagon of what General Assembly and others have done? But that's...
I can answer that question for you if you'd like.
I'd like to hear it.
The reason that extensions have not jumped on that is because extensions are, and I'm sure my listeners will correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the last numbers that I looked at, they were lost leaders at institutions. And institutions of all kinds, I don't care whether it's UCLA or the University of Minnesota or NYU, are losing. Absolutely. And they are looking for the deepest revenue drivers that they can possibly have, which is why you still have to make a leap over here now to another thing, which we're not going to talk about that on this podcast, but it's something that's personally interesting to me. College athletics.
Right.
Continues to be a main driver for most, right? And so, or student affairs doesn't get funded as much or as often because it's also a loss leader.
And I think so. We talked about this whole pipeline from K through 12 to higher ed,
right?
But guess what's missing outside of that is the employers. And if you go on any, you know, job listing or anything like that, people are still going to ask for a certain level of qualifications: a JD, an MBA, a BA, a BS, a this, a that. Right? They are not saying send us a link to your GitHub and to your, you know, to your
classification on Product Hunt.
Yeah. Like no one's asking for those things. Now, of course, you'll find a few that say they don't care about degrees, but that's so few of those, right? So it's, when I talk about the pipeline, we're also thinking about those employers who are then going to say, well, you need to have graduated from the top schools. Why is it that Google and others, Apple and others will only recruit from the top tier schools, even though their founders didn't even actually complete school? What does that say? That's an interesting thing.
As a mediator, a person trained in mediation and as a peace builder, I do a lot of work on mindsets. And so mindsets are huge in all of this entire pipeline conversation, because while Eric and Sergey and Larry may not have graduated college, they went through the K through 12 pipeline. That was the old school pipeline. And those messages set a mindset that this is the way, and I'm doing air quotes, this is the way things are done.
Right.
And they automatically grew up in a household where this is the way things are done. When little Eric Schmidt was 10 years old, little Eric Schmidt's father had been educated underneath the rubric of the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
So what's little Eric Schmidt going to do when he has the opportunity to hire somebody in human resources at Google to write a job description? Well, he's going to hire somebody that also came out of that same mindset, and it's just going to continue to perpetuate, even though Google is going to continue to do bleeding edge stuff.
Right.
So it's mindsets and mindset training. And if little Eric Schmidt was never challenged along that K through 12, and I'm not picking on Eric,
Mm-hmm.
it could be little Mark Zuckerberg,
Mm-hmm.
whoever,
Mm-hmm.
but was trained along that pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
They're just going to continue to replicate that unless they're challenged along
Right.
that. And if no one ever challenged them along that, they're not going to replicate anything different.
And that's why I want to challenge that. That's why I want to challenge sort of the whole entire continuum, right?
Right. Yep. Well, and okay, this is not on my list of questions, but I want to shift to this just for just a second, and then we're going to shift back. We're going to talk about the entrepreneur stuff, and then we're going to go to a little bit of a global level. You mentioned, and I picked up on this, you mentioned STEM, and you focused on, and your example was the electrical engineer, and you focused on STEM. And a lot of these conversations focus on technical expertise. Mm-hmm. I mentioned to a previous guest on the podcast earlier this season that who came out of theology, has a theology and philosophy background, and is now a coder. His issue is not that we need to get more items in more kids' hands so they can do more hacking. For him, it was, why aren't they reading St. Thomas Aquinas? Okay. Two different perspectives.
Right.
I come out of the humanities. I mean, I've talked about this before on the podcast. I mentioned it before. I typically mention it all the time. But my background is in the humanities and the arts. That made me creative and entrepreneurial. Mm-hmm. It also made me question everything, including STEM people, asking the questions why.
Right.
So how do we, in the K through 12 arena, get the science education better?
Right.
And I also want my kids reading the Metamorphosis by Ovid because I want them to have both of those things, because both of those things are equally important, because you can design the best, most greatest open AI, but if open AI becomes Skynet and kills us all because you decided, hey, what the heck, I don't like people, that's kind of a problem.
Right.
I mean, look at climate change and global warming, or whatever you want to call it. We had a bunch of people that were arrogant and decided they were going to kill the earth.
Right.
Well, are we just creating a line by just focusing on STEM of little more arrogant people that are going to maybe not necessarily kill the earth, but kill us because they didn't study Ovid and figure out that, or Macbeth by Shakespeare? Like, I don't know. Where does humanities fit into this? That's a big question.
I think that, and I'm a humanities major. I majored in anthropology, so I question lots of things. I also focused on human development, language, and everything like that. So I really like to look at the interaction of people. And I think, like you, I'm equally as concerned about art and literature and whether or not students have the ability to be empathetic, right? Whether or not we have the ability to learn from our past mistakes, right? And you don't necessarily get that if you're only learning C++, right? And so although I've been living this STEM world and living within this STEM world for 10 years, I am not a coder. I am not a developer. I've had to learn to talk to and communicate and to direct engineers and developers and creatives all along the spectrum. I really believe it's my experience as a teacher, is my experience in my studies in anthropology that actually helped me work through working with these different groups of people. And I don't believe that we can move through, everyone's on this STEM craze, right? Everyone's talking about coding, and we just had the hour of code week or code week. I think it's so important, just like I think it's important that students learn a second language, right? We know the science behind learning a second language even younger than what we currently do in this country. But so I think that literature, I want my students like you to read Macbeth. I want them to read Toni Morrison's Bluest Eye. I really want them to have a real well-rounded experience, because I think that helps them move forward in life. I think it's just hot because people think that's where all the money is going to come from, right? And so we don't stop and tell kids, hey, within a company like Google, there are more people who are non-developers in that company than there are actually developers. We don't teach them that. Everyone thinks that everyone in a tech company is sitting at a computer and just typing away some code that for me looks like Mandarin, right? And I think we don't teach them. While we used to say, kids, you can become a doctor, a lawyer, a police officer, a fireman, a teacher, right? Now we've got kids saying, I want to be a Java developer. I want to be a coder, right? And that in itself is limiting as well. We rob kids of the ability to do and become whatever they want to be when we just tell them code and then everything will be at your fingertips.
Everything will be at your fingertips.
That's not true.
Yeah. Well, and me personally, I mean, I think we need a lot more. We need a lot more W.E.B. Du Bois, and we need a lot more Booker T. Washingtons at Twitter. You know,
We do.
and I'm not saying that. You know, I mean, like we need more souls of Black folk, you know, down at Twitter,
right?
Versus maybe versus another coder. You
right.
know, maybe we don't need another coder. Maybe we don't. Maybe we need somebody at Twitter, or maybe we need somebody at Squarespace, or maybe we need somebody at. I don't know, like Elon Musk's and Sam Altman's OpenAI project.
Right.
Maybe we need a few philosophers down there, you know, saying to Elon, hey, listen, 5,000 years of human philosophy says this. We've been thinking about this for a while before we go running off to develop, you know, the next thing that's gonna help us or hurt us.
Right. We think about the self-driving cars, right? And so now we're thinking about self-driving cars and making a decision between crashing, right, and hurting me, or barreling through a person who's walking across the street, or a pet or a dog or something like that, right? And now we're getting the computer to be able to make that decision. Now, we like to think that computers are in itself a computer and it just runs on its own, but we actually, people, humans, program a computer what to do. A computer is not really thinking on its own, despite what IBM and Watson want to tell you. So when we have things like self-driving cars or drones or whatever, people are behind that. And I want people who are building those things who have read Macbeth, who have read Their Eyes Are Watching God. I want those people who are making those decisions and programming those computers to make those kind of decisions to have had that kind of experience. And
exactly.
And that's important to me. And I think that we know that it's important, but we just don't know how many of those philosophers are in the room at that time. We don't know how many of those people who were only fed a STEM education or only lived on Reddit for the last 5 years, or if they were listening to TED Talks and they were, meeting people or gardening. I don't know, but that's important to me. And I think that we should all consider that, right?
Yeah,
as we move forward.
Well, let's do a pivot. I want you mentioned a couple times those experiences, and your background as an anthropologist, your education in anthropology, which I think is fascinating. I will tell you, anthropology classes were some of the, I won't say they were the most difficult classes, because anthropology is relatively simple to understand. However, it's very complex in its implications. And so, when I was an undergrad and I took a couple of anthropology classes, and had some great debates.
I was going to say, you must have had some really great debates in there.
Almost as good as the debates I had in my philosophy classes. So they kind of overlapped in a lot of ways. And sometimes, I would, just because of my nature, I might take a contrarian point of view, or I might agree, and then let's see how far we're gonna push this. But talking about your experiences as an anthropologist, as a person who does not code, how does that sort of dovetail with your experiences as a woman and a minority, and an entrepreneur as well? Because everything you've been talking about for the last half hour has been about an entrepreneurial mindset. At least that's how that's the filter I'm having it come at me through, and I think many of my listeners are going to have it come through. But you're a woman and a minority and an entrepreneur and an anthropologist. You're all these things that are not or other in comparison to the environment you're currently in. What have those experiences been like? And tell us a little bit about that.
I think one, so my sort of transition from being a teacher and a dean in a junior high school into the private sector world was into a company that developed a software for schools. So it was an easy, in air quotes, transition for me, because I was theoretically, I was their end user, right? So who better than a person like me to come in and help them? And and so I was well respected, and I was treated fairly as I was moving up the ranks in that particular company, because I was the only educator who was at that time working in the company. So I was really well respected. It was people outside of the company. I think one who didn't expect me to walk through that door at a high-powered meeting, or people who said offhanded remarks to me at trade shows or things like that. I had to grow a lot of thick skin over the years, not so much from inside of the companies that I was at, but from outside of the company. And I took that on in building that thick skin because I knew that I was paving the way for other young women, for other people of color, specifically Black people. We need to have positive role models. We need to have people who look like us, who act like us, who talk like us to help us pull us through, even if not like physically, right? So I think I spent all this time obviously in the tech world, and I grew and I climbed the corporate ladder, let's say, and I hit a roadblock. I was in a series of meetings with angel investors and VCs, and I realized there were things that I did not know that they were talking about. Again, it was like listening to Mandarin, right? They were talking about EBITDA multiples and all these things that I just didn't know. And there's a story I like to tell, not to hurt anyone individually, but really this was a point of a pivot in my life. I was in one of these meetings, and one of the investors, we had many, many meetings with this gentleman who was very, very kind. And he said to me, and to both of us who were in the room, I being female, one being male, he asked us both, where do we see ourselves in the next 3 years? And the gentleman who was sitting next to me, he answered first. And so he had all these, grand ideas. He wanted to sell his company for $50 million. He wanted to make a gazillion dollars. He wanted this. He wanted to start another company. It was all great, right? It was very awesome. And then the investor looked at me. He said, well, Qiana, where do you see yourself in 3 years? And before I could even utter a word out, the gentleman next to me said, hopefully married with children. And
I'm just shaking my head. I know the listeners can't hear me, but I'm just shaking my head.
Yeah.
I know they can't see me.
As I swallow deeply every time I have to tell this story, because that in itself is a good example of what me just being a woman, just being, my anatomy says I'm a woman and I was born a woman, that will lead a person who respects me and I respect him. But he said that, right? And I paused, and then I had an answer. And my answer did not include children or being married, because that's not what the investor was asking me, right? I didn't feel like he was asking me what did I want in my personal life. I thought what he was asking me, where did I see myself professionally? Because he wanted to know, should I invest in this company if you are not going to be there, or are you going to stick around if I'm going to be here? And so that's what he was asking me. And so I realized, one, I didn't know what EBITDA multiples are. I didn't know all this language that was utilized in these meetings sometimes. And I knew that that's how people saw me, that I was a woman in her 30s and she was likely just going to leave and go and get married and have a kid. Well, I have to tell your listeners that I do want those things, but I don't think that I have to give up my professional life for those things at the same time. And so I actually went back to school and got my MBA, because I realized I'm just going to continue to be in these meetings, and I want to understand everything that's being said, and I want to be able to correct people when they're wrong, and I want to be able to be a full-fledged person who has the ability to be in this meeting and contribute. And I don't want anyone to think my womanness, right, or my Blackness will in any way prevent me from being able to be fully fledged in depth in that meeting or in this circle. And so that was a real hard lesson for me. And there were lots of other things that happened and that were said. Men will typically over sexualize you. So men will comment on your clothing if you do a presentation, or they'll do all kinds of things. I was in a really scary situation where I was meeting with a client and he said something inappropriate, and I didn't actually believe I was going to make it out of his car alive, right? Men don't experience these things, right? And you just kind of take this stuff on, and it's like a badge of courage, but it's sort of like, why do I have to do that, right? And I can't move mountains by myself, but the more of us that are there, the more women, the more people of color, it will become the norm. And that's what I want. I want it to be normal that I'm in there.
The view from outside of Silicon Valley is that Silicon Valley is insular and a little bit arrogant and a little bit condescending, a little bit disassociated from reality, a little bit lacking in understanding of what the average American, quote unquote, whatever that means, but average American goes through or experiences on a day-to-day basis. The view from outside of Silicon Valley is particularly the minority viewpoint from outside of Silicon Valley, if Silicon Valley is thought of at all, is, well, I don't know what goes on over there. I don't have any idea what they're doing. I really don't understand any of that. It goes, I don't have a paradigm to be able to place that next to go, yes, I understand that.
Right.
And
just so that you know that our schools are more segregated than they have ever been in this nation's history. So when
this is where I'm going to,
when they say they don't understand, it's right. They don't.
Yeah, they don't understand. Yeah, they don't understand. And so this is where I'm going to. When people have the opportunity to choose, they will.
Yeah.
People will choose their entertainment. We see that with Netflix and streaming and that kind of stuff. When people have the opportunity to choose their social networks, they will. We see this with Facebook and Twitter and Pinterest and on and on and on. When they have the opportunity to choose their food or choose the type of neighborhoods they want to live in. People will live in gated communities. And again, it's this ability to choose, right? And that gets back to the access piece. I'm going to tie all this in. When women and minorities have the opportunity to choose, how do we show me the way? What's the way to get them to choose, I'm going to go there? What's the way to educate them to choose that, to make that choice so that there are more people in that room? Because I mean, my own personal biography, I was born in New Mexico. Nobody in my family is an entrepreneur. I love my mother dearly, but my mother worked for the federal government for 35 years because it was steady work. She did what she had to do. You know what I mean?
That's
I'm not knocking
large
it.
Percentage of older black families. Yeah.
Right. And so there are no guidelines for doing what I do. There's nobody I can reach back to and go, hey, I experienced this disappointment in this room. If something like that, like what you had described in your story, had happened to me, and we've talked about this off the air, but if something like that had happened to me,
right.
my father would have come out.
Right, right.
How do we get people to make this choice?
Mentorship.
How do we show them that this is the way to go? Okay,
mentorship is key. I think that when we look at, so we're still sticking with this continuum of kids going to colleges and everything like that. Who are the companies that are going to the career fairs, right? Like once you're almost at the end point of getting your degree. I didn't know what I was doing. Right? I didn't. I mean, and that my parents were like, well, why did you even major in anthropology? Like, what is that? And what are you going to do with that? Right? Like, it didn't make any sense to them. And so it's sort of like, once, if you're there and you're at that stage, what is it that you do? Like, what do you do with a theology major? What do you do with a philosophy major? What do you do as an anthropology major? It's not really clear and well defined for us. And there's just not that many jobs for anthropologists. Let's just be honest, right? So I think that there's a part of this that really, we talk about mentorship. Mentorship is really, really key, I think, at a young age, right? And I'm a mentor to several young women. and young men too, from high school through college and then post college. So it's really important. I think mentorship is important. I don't necessarily want people to take my path. I don't. What I want them to do is explore everything that is at their fingertips, right? And I don't want them to think about who they are going to become. I want them to think about all the problems that they would like to solve. Like, what is the thing that is nagging you? Like, is there someone else working on it? What are you inspired by? What really gets your mojo going? And can you make a career out of that? Can you make a one career out of that? Because as we know, the research has shown that we have multiple careers now at this stage. So I really think it's important that mentorship is really important. Be visible, right? Be visible. Just to answer a text message, to respond to an email, to go and grab a cup of coffee or grab lunch with a student or someone. I have the benefit, because I was a teacher, that I have all these babies, right, who are now adults, and I feel so old. Gosh. And so I was actually just
Right.
at a gallery opening on Saturday night for one of my former students. He graduated from UCLA. He's an artist. Like, this is all these great things. And I feel so old, and yet I feel so young being around him. And he's got this great red hair, and it's just awesome. But it's the fact that we don't give kids that, how important mentorship is. And I really would like to have everyone who's in a professional to say, you know what, I'm going to devote an hour of my time a week to someone, right? And hopefully someone different than me. Because your mentor doesn't have to have the same upbringing as you. They don't have to look like you. They don't have to have the same orientation as you. It doesn't matter. I think that in itself sparks so much in kids and young adults. So that, my thing is, mentorship is really critical and key, so that you know that essentially the sky is the limit, right? And then that
Yeah.
in turn allows to open up doors as well for people, which we know in Silicon Valley is a problem, right?
Right.
Your network often dictates the jobs that you will have. Your network will dictate who you get introduced to, what jobs you have, all those things, right? And a lot of people, like yourself, like myself, I don't come from a family or a community that had a network really deep. Like, I'm from Seattle. I grew up there. I don't know anyone who worked for Microsoft. Right? And so,
Okay.
right? And so think about that, right? So there's no one who was pulling me in and saying, hey, as a high school student, you should do this program at Microsoft, right? Microsoft, in my backyard. No, I didn't know, not one person. Not one person, but I did know people who had worked at Lockheed Martin, thinking about the Industrial Revolution, people who worked at Boeing, who oftentimes were pink slip, because when there's no, you're not building a plane, then you don't have any work, right? So those are the people that I knew. So,
and that's the mindset.
That's
and
the
that's the kind of
mindset.
messages that you're getting. Yep. We have a few minutes left, so I want to make this as impactful as possible. What problems would you like to solve? The mentorship piece. How do we get very, very smart people at Stanford who are in Y Combinator to determine that the problem they would like to solve is this mentorship issue of minorities and entrepreneurs and or lack of minority entrepreneurs, lack of female entrepreneurs? How do we get those very intelligent, brilliant Stanford Y Combinator individuals to mentor an hour of their very busy 120-hour a week? I'm building the next thing I'm building the next homebrew.
It's easy.
And I said that on purpose. I can't believe I just said that on purpose. I snapped right on this podcast. Oh, snap.
He actually liked a tweet I did this morning, Hunter. If he's listening, he and I need to talk. But here's the key. If one of the things that we know, we said in the beginning, that we have not gotten rid of, right? We haven't gotten rid of the K-12 system. We haven't gotten rid of higher ed as we know it. Easy. Make it a part of your graduation, of your diploma, right?
Whoops. Wait,
Whoa, make it a part
wait,
of
no, wait, no. How would you graduate? How would you judge that? Like, who would be in charge? I mean, there's a bureaucracy and there's blah, 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 right?
yeah, any problem is worth solving, right? So, I mean, I
Right.
think that piece is critical. So my thing is, you've got boosters. So you talked about the athletics. You have big corporations coming in. You're gonna, you want to recruit from our top talent. Just pick whoever the top 10 companies that have been recruiting from your school for the last 10 years. You go to them because you're obviously huge to them and hugely important to them, and say, you know what? And now you need to mentor our students. Now you need to devote some of your time to mentoring our students, a certain number of hours per semester or quarter, right? And do you think those top companies would say no to that?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, it would be a value add.
Would it
I
be a
would even
value
go a
add?
step I would go a step further and I would say to the students who are going to those schools, you have a responsibility to mentor somebody where
Absolutely.
you came
Then
from.
it's cyclical, right? And so
Right.
then it
Yeah.
just becomes a part. It becomes the normal thing, right? For me,
Right.
it's ingrained. For me, it was ingrained because I have students, and I started teaching at such a young age that the
Mhm.
students sort of felt that I was kind of like, as I've gotten older, like I'm their friend. I'm not like really, really old, right? And so they feel
Mhm.
like we've got Facebook, we're connected on Facebook, they see me out, they see me hanging out, stuff like that. So they reach out to me, right? It's easy, like no brainer.
Right.
Um, but I think that also, like, it's just embedded. And I also actively said, you have a question, you can always ask. You need help, you can always ask me. I make
Mhm.
myself available for them, right? I don't make myself so untouchable that they don't think that they can reach out. And I think that we have things like Twitter, and we have people like Hunter Walk, and we have others
Mhm.
who will give advice, who will respond, right? And then you have people who won't respond at all. But I think we have to take that a step further. Like, we have to teach kids the art of networking. What do you do when you go away from a networking event? Like, all these things. Like, how do you
Yeah.
follow up? Ask for coffee. You don't know what you want to ask, but say, hey, I just want to pick your brain for 30 minutes. Can I take you out for a cup of coffee? We don't teach people that. And those are the things that are really important, how mentorships start, and it becomes like a lifelong learning for both people, both parties involved.
With a background that I have in collaboration and sort of collaborative peace building strategies, I realize just like there's never just one person. Well, there can be one person in a conflict by themselves with themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, that can happen. But that's more the purview of a therapist or a psychologist or a
I'm sure
psychotherapist.
you've done your fair share of hours in that arena as well.
um,
That's for another
but
podcast.
that's for another podcast. That's the other podcast. Um, but I do know that conflict exists between two people, and that the solution to that problem exists between two people. So what you're talking about when I hear it again is filtering it through my perception is collaborative learning,
Yeah.
and collaborative engagement and collaborative mentorship.
Mm-hmm.
And I would expand that to say, and I know we're picking on Silicon Valley right now, but let's move out past that. Let's say, Ford, in Provo, Utah. Why isn't the Ford plant in Provo, Utah, sending out people from the Ford plant to mentor people? Or I've got Lockheed Martin in my backyard, and not knocking Lockheed Martin, but I'm not aware of any mentorship program that Lockheed Martin is running.
So you know what they say, what's valuable? Our time.
Our time,
We
yes.
our
Well, okay,
time is so valuable, right? No,
right,
so, and I say that in this way, that
yeah,
people value what they put time into, and vice versa, right? And so it's easy to write a check. It's easy to write a check to the Provo, Utah schools. It's easy to write a check to your local school and for Ford to feel like they've invested in the community, invested. But real investment into communities, into schools, into our ecosystems in which we pull talent and people and resources from is that time, right? And how much time are you willing to give? What is it of value to you? And what you
yeah,
may not see the end result in a year or in 2 months or 6 months, but what will happen in 4 years or 8 years down the road, right? And how you
mhm,
cultivate community in schools is time in. And time is really valuable to people. And that's why, guess what? In Silicon Valley and other places, it's really hard to get people's time.
Yeah.
There you go.
Well,
but they'll write
time
a check.
is the only...
They'll write a check. Like, so Mark Zuckerberg can and others can say, I'm going to write a check to New Jersey schools for $100 million. And we're all thinking, God, that's a lot of money. But how much time did he spend in those schools? How much time?
Yeah.
Right? Because guess what? His time is worth more than $100 million check.
Than that $100 million check.
Yeah. And it's not knocking him. I'm not knocking him. I'm not knocking you, Mark, if you're listening. I'm just saying that's the thing. That's important.
Yeah.
Time.
Well, I mean, and I think we have to have these challenging conversations. We have to have these challenging ideas out here, and we have to talk about the link between education and sort of people's perceptions of the world and mindsets, and how do we move forward a culture where technology is rapidly developing. As a previous guest of mine said, the technologists are coming, whether we're all ready or not.
Right. And they won't all be kind.
And then it won't all be kind. So, we need to be really focused on this education piece. We really need to be focused on this development piece. And you're one of those people that's working at that intersection and is having these challenging thoughts and having these challenging conversations. I know you are.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you, Qiana, for coming on the podcast today. I value your time.
Thank you. I enjoyed giving you my time today.
Oh, well, very good. Thank you. It was a stimulating hour, and I know my listeners have gotten quite a lot out of it and have been challenged, and I'm sure you're going to get some feedback, some tweets, some awesome things from this. One last question. Is there anything that you would like to promote today?
Oh, anything I would like to promote? Mentorship, not even my own. I want to promote mentorship to those listeners that you have. I challenge them to mentor someone, whether they be a younger person within their company or someone who is at a university or even at a high school. I challenge them to find one mentee this year.
Awesome. That's a great challenge. That's a long-term challenge, and we're playing the long game here on the Earbud U podcast. Well, once again, thank you, Qiana, for coming on the Earbud U podcast. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Enjoyed it.
Absolutely.
Bye.